In terms of the format for today, I do have some PowerPoint slides up here, which I'll take you through. I'll be talking through, firstly, a bit of background on the Open Government Partnership and Australia's process to join the Open Government Partnership and to develop this first action plan. I'll also be talking through a little bit about the interim working group, which we established in August this year to help inform the drafting of the action plan. I'll then take you through the plan itself, give you an overview of the 5 themes that we have in the plan and 14 different commitments. And then we'll talk through a little bit around implementation and governance. For those of you who just joined, just again, I just want to reiterate, we do have everyone here on mute at the moment. What we're going to do is just try to take any questions through the chat function just to avoid any background noise during the webinar. So if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the chat. I'll try to take a couple of questions during every segment, if anyone has any. We'll be collating the rest of the questions and we'll try to leave them to the end. If there's anything that we can't answer today, we'll document those questions and we'll look to do a blog post on our OGP Australia blog and try to answer them to the best of our ability on the blog. Alrighty, well, let's kick off. So I'll talk a little bit now just about the Open Government Partnership itself and what it's all about. So the OGP is a multilateral initiative that was established in 2011 by the heads of state of 8 founding governments. So that included the United States and the United Kingdom as 2 of the key instigators, but also Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Norway, Philippines, and South Africa. The aims and goals of the OGP are to secure concrete commitments from governments to promote transparency, empower citizens, fight corruption, and harness new technologies to strengthen governance. So it's actually grown now from those 8 founding governments to 70 participating countries worldwide, of which Australia is one. To become a member of the OGP, participating countries have to meet 4 different eligibility criteria, and there's a bit of a points scoring system that the OGP uses to determine whether a country can join. Those eligibility criteria relate to fiscal and budget transparency, laws governing access to government information, laws governing the disclosure of income and assets of public officials, as well as citizen engagement in policy making. Participating countries also need to sign what's known as the Open Government Declaration, which was established by the OGP. And they also, most importantly, have to deliver a country action plan every 2 years. So Australia's action plan is obviously due this year. We're in an even year cycle. Our next plan will be due in 2018. It's really great. This is an iterative process. It allows us to develop a plan, look at how we did it, look at where we got to, and try to improve and build on that over time. So action plans need to include ambitious commitments to enhance transparency, accountability, public participation, and technological innovation. And there's also one of the other requirements of the OGP is that there is a process around independent reporting on progress. In terms of its structure, a lot of people often ask, what is the OGP? Is this a United Nations thing? Is it an OECD thing? It's actually its own independent entity, but as I mentioned, it was established by governments back in 2011. It's overseen by a steering committee, which is comprised of representatives of participating governments and civil society organisations. So it's governed by, by this overriding notion of the Open Government Partnership that governments should be working in collaboration with civil society. There's also a support unit which acts as a secretariat to the partnership and supports governments and civil society organisations in their participation worldwide. Alrighty, I might just check now if we've got any questions at all on the OGP. If not, we'll move on. There is some more information on their website if you'd like to have a look and if you're interested further. So now I'd just like to talk a little bit about Australia's process to finalise its membership and how we got to where we are now with the Draft National Action Plan. So it was actually in 2013 that the former government wrote to the Open Government Partnership indicating Australia's intent to join as a member. You can't see that on the slide here at the moment, but in a stakeholder workshop in Canberra in April this year, where government and selected civil society representatives who attended the workshop worked together to prioritise what are the commitments that we want to include in the plan, and what could they look like. We then had a little bit of a break over the caretaker period when the federal election was running. After the caretaker period, we did get some feedback from civil society on the process so far. We tried to undertake a little bit of a refresh. We wanted, sorry, I'll just try to put that back up. There we go. What we tried to do was refresh and develop, what we did was establish an interim working group of senior government officials and civil society representatives to help inform the drafting of the plan, working together, ensuring that it wasn't just government officials working around the table, taking into account the public consultation that was undertaken earlier in the year, informing the action plan, but it was both a joint government and civil society process. So the working group has been working together now since late August to help inform the drafting of the action plan that was released last week. We're now in the third and final phase of public consultation, where we've obviously released the plan for public comments. Comments were due on the 14th, next Monday, but we've actually just announced, just ahead of this webinar, following some feedback from all of you, that you'd like some extra time, that we are going to extend the time frame until the end of next week, so next Friday, the 18th of November. That gives a little bit more time, and what we're really trying to do here is to ensure that we submit the plan before the end of this year, because there are requirements from the Open Government Partnership around when these plans need to be developed and submitted, and there are consequences, of course, for not meeting those. Alrighty, do we have any questions there, Caroline? No? All right, no worries, we'll keep moving on. Now I just want to just briefly talk about the interim working group and its role in developing the action plan. You can see here on the screen a few photos of the working group in action. So the working group, its role was essentially to leverage the ideas and submissions that had been received in that first phase of consultation and help shape and prioritise what would go into the first action plan. The working group operated, government came to the working group with some broad priorities that are identified based on the submissions that had come forward earlier this year. The interim working group discussed and prioritised commitments for the plan, and the civil society members raised other proposals for further exploration. And many of those made their way into the plan. And one of the points that I've been really trying to make at the public information sessions that we've been holding around the country is that I really think that this plan and the way that the draft plan that was released last week is a different product than what it would have been if it was just government officials sitting around the table. And that's thanks to, I think in large part, to the working group and the approach that it took. Alrighty, so if we've got no questions on the process so far, we might get into what everyone's here to talk about, and that is the action plan itself. So I just want to start by saying that Australia already starts from a relatively high base here internationally compared to a lot of other countries. But of course, we're not perfect, and there's always plenty of room for improvement. So we see this first action plan as an opportunity to build on the strong foundation that we already have, to continue engaging with civil society over time, and to continue identifying new initiatives and strengthen our efforts. This is the first plan. Like I mentioned earlier, there will be a process to develop action plans into the future. So this is an iterative process. This is where we start, but it's certainly not the last chance to have your say, and it's certainly not the last effort from government in the space. So the aim of this first plan is to improve and build confidence in Australian institutions, institutions both within government but also outside of government, and also strengthen our democracy by upholding the principles outlined in the Open Government Declaration. And I've outlined, those principles are outlined there on the slide. What I want to highlight is that the open government is actually a very broad term, and the Open Government Partnership takes a very broad perspective about what it means. I mentioned earlier, transparency, accountability, public participation, and technological innovation, which covers issues such as open data and digital transformation. Given that, we've tried to take a very broad scope to the plan as well. As I mentioned, we've got 5 themes. They are transparency and accountability in business, open data and digital transformation, access to government information, integrity in the public sector, and public participation and engagement. And under those 5 themes, we've got 14 different commitments, which I'll step through in a sec. Commitments themselves, if you've had a chance to read the plan yet, or if you're going to, you'll notice that the commitments themselves are relatively high level. There is still a lot of detail to be worked through. But importantly, a lot of the commitments do include an element of public consultation built into them. So this consultation process is not the last chance for you to have your say in a lot of these commitments. There will be further opportunities for public consultation. Alrighty. So if we've got no questions generally then, we'll jump into our first theme, which is transparency and accountability in business. Like I said, I'm happy to take a couple of questions after each of these segments. So if you've got any, feel free to type them into the group chat. Caroline will let me know when they've come through. If not, we can wait to questions at the end. So through these three commitments under this theme, what we're looking to do is to enhance Australia's already strong reputation for responsible, accountable and transparent business practices. Our first commitment here is around improving whistleblower protections in the tax and corporate sectors, and I think this is a pretty exciting commitment. Public sector whistleblowers, so for those of us in the Commonwealth Government, for example, already have quite significant protections under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which was established in 2013. Employees in the corporate sector, on the other hand, don't enjoy those same protections, and that can certainly prevent people from coming forward and reporting issues of misconduct, of corruption, of illegal behaviour. So there's two elements to this first commitment. The first is around tax whistleblowers. So the government announced in the budget this year that it'll be looking to strengthen protections for whistleblowers who report tax misconduct to the Australian Taxation Office. And what we're trying to do with the action plan is to use it as a vehicle to take that commitment forward, and we've outlined some very clear milestones around how we'll go forward in terms of consultation, a decision around what that will look like, and then legislating that commitment. We've then got a second part of the commitment which goes further than what the government announced in the budget this year, and that's around consulting on reforms to harmonise whistleblower protections in the corporate sector with those in the public sector. And I think that's quite a significant commitment. It's something that people have been looking forward for a long time. And it's something where I think Australia is like a little bit behind some other countries globally. Alrighty, next I'll just talk a little bit about beneficial ownership. So beneficial ownership register shows who ultimately benefits from the activities of companies. What we've committed to in this plan is to consult on the details, scope and implementation of the beneficial ownership register here in Australia. What it can do is it can help combat tax avoidance and other fraudulent conduct by making it harder for companies to use complex financial arrangements, shell companies or frontmen to hide revenues and other activities. So the government will be considering recommendations by mid-2017 around what that beneficial ownership register will look like. As I mentioned earlier, there are, many of these commitments have consultation built into them, and beneficial ownership register is one we'll be looking to further consult. Final commitment here is around natural resource transparency, and this is all about what we call the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or the EITI for short, is a global standard to promote the open and accountable management of natural resources such as oil, gas and mineral resources. It requires countries to be transparent and report on company payments and government revenues received from these sectors. So the Australian government's already been a long-time supporter of this initiative. We've especially supported its implementation in developing countries worldwide, where there has been quite a lot of issues around transparency and corruption in these sectors. From 2011 to 2014, the government also ran a pilot to test how we could implement the initiative within Australia. And in May this year, we formally announced our intention to seek compliance with the EITI. So again, what we're trying to do here is use the action plan as a vehicle to take that forward and to set out how we're going to ensure that we meet that compliance with the EITI. That includes establishing a multi-stakeholder group representing industry, NGOs and governments to oversee implementation. So that's it for that first theme. I think we've got a couple of questions already. So I will go to those. We've got one question here from Amanda, and that is, what kind of consultation is likely generally? So Amanda, if that's in regards to the further consultations that we're following up on each of these individual commitments in the plan, so what will come after the plan is finalised, it does vary from commitment to commitment in terms of the consultations that will be undertaken. For example, if we take the whistleblower commitment, I think the plan sets out some timeframes around starting consultation in December this year. I understand there may be some sort of issues or consultation paper that will be released, which will facilitate consultation on that. Other commitments, and I'll talk about some of those later, such as the commitment around establishing a multi-stakeholder forum to continue engaging on the open government partnership between government and civil society. I think what we'll look to do there is invite some submissions and ideas around, well, what could that multi-stakeholder forum look like? What we don't want to do is have a situation where government's making decisions around what some of these forums will look like through this process, where we understand we've got a limited time frame. We want to make sure that that we give some extra time after this process is finished to really work through and settle what the details of some of these commitments will be. We've also got a question here from Nigel around, will the beneficial ownership register leverage AUSTRAC reporting data under the FTR Act? That's a very specific question, Nigel. I don't have the answer to that question at the moment. I don't think we have the answer to that question at the moment. You'll notice in the beneficial ownership register commitment that we still need to go quite a long way to settling the details, scope and implementation of what this will look like. Who will manage its implementation, how the data will be managed. So there's still a lot of those details to be worked out, but certainly I'll follow up with the Treasury after this webinar is completed, and we'll look to follow up and provide you with some feedback on that on the blog. I'll just take one more question here before we finish up on this theme. I do want to say we do have a couple more questions that have been sent through. We will come to all of the questions at the end. We are collating them all. We've got a question here from Paul, which came through earlier. Sorry, I skipped over that before. Can Ryan further explain the whistleblower protections for the public sector? Certainly. So, Paul, I won't go into too much detail about it now, but you can certainly look up some further information online, and we can certainly provide you with a summary of that as well. But we did, the former government did introduce the Public Interest Disclosure Act back in 2013, which sets out a range of protections for whistleblowers in the public sector, and really strengthens the protections that were already in place prior to that. It's all about, really this is all about ensuring that when people report misconduct or corruption or wrongdoing, that they don't have to fear for their employment. So that's really what the objective of that legislation is all about. But we can certainly follow up and provide you with some more detailed information on that after this session. Great. We do have a couple more questions. Like I said, we'll come to those at the end of the session, or if you've got some further questions on this next segment, we'll go to those. Alrighty, our next theme here is around open data and digital transformation. And this is obviously quite a priority agenda for the government already, and certainly for the Prime Minister. And just to give you an example, there's been quite a lot of progress on this agenda so far. So since 2013, the number of discoverable data sets on data.gov.au has increased from around 500 to over 20,000. So it's quite a significant increase. And this is giving you opportunities for the public sector, the private sector, the academic and research sector, and also the not-for-profit sector to use this data and try to extract value from it. And when I talk about value, I'm not just talking about economic value, I'm also talking about social values. There's a lot of really important social outcomes that can be achieved by using this data as well. So what we're trying to do through the action plan is try to further this agenda even more than what has been achieved so far. It includes a commitment here around implementing the government's election commitments to identify and release high-value data sets. Now, what we're trying to do through the action plan is to do that in quite a collaborative way. We want to ensure that this isn't just government sort of identifying what is a high-value data set. It's really important that we're working with the private sector, with the academic sector, and the not-for-profit sector to identify what is a high-value data set, what are the characteristics of a high-value data set, and what are some of the data sets that government holds that people want access to. So we're looking at holding a series of roundtables. One of those has already actually been held to try to work through that and develop a bit of a framework around what a high-value data set is and how we'll go about releasing them. There's also a commitment there to expand the DataStart initiative, which is about promoting data-driven innovation in the private sector. We've also got a commitment here around building and maintaining public trust to address concerns about data sharing. And this is obviously a very topical issue as well. Certainly something that's at the forefront of the government's mind. And what we're talking about here is engaging in a conversation with the community to better understand what are the concerns about the open data agenda and how can we better address them. It's also about building better privacy management, risk management capability within government. So obviously privacy of people's personal information is an enormously important factor when it comes to the open data agenda. What we don't want is a situation where people's personal information is compromised. So certainly the Privacy Act already underpins the open data agenda. What we want to do is work with agencies across government to make sure that they've actually got the capability when releasing this data to make sure that people's privacy is protected. We've also got a commitment here around digitally transforming the delivery of government services. And that's about reinforcing the government's agenda here around making it easier and more accessible for people to engage with the government online. What the commitment's all about is developing a digital transformation roadmap, which will be setting out the priorities and also a pathway to delivering on this agenda. And it's also got a component around establishing public dashboards, which provide transparency around the performance of government services. So we've got a bit of a baseline to work from. We can look at, well, how is this digital transformation agenda actually working in practice to make it easier and more accessible for the public to interact with government. Alrighty, that's it for the overview on the open data and digital transformation commitments. I might just go to see if we've got any more questions on that at the moment. No, Caroline, nothing at all at the moment. Is there anything from the previous session at all that's worthwhile covering? EITI, I'll come back to that at the end. Daniel and Chris's questions on the EITI and also questions from Chris as well, which have been sent through. And I certainly do have a copy of these here, Chris, and we'll get to those at the end as well. Alrighty, our third thing here is around access to government information. It's about improving and modernising. Oh, sorry, I think we've just got a comment here through from Nigel. Privacy is not just about protection and security, it's also about informed and revocable consent for sharing in the first place. Thanks very much, Nigel. All right, so we're just going into our next section on access to government information. So this is about improving and modernising the way in which the public accesses government information. We've got three commitments here again. Our first one here, titled Information Management and Access Laws for the 21st Century, is essentially looking at reform options for the legislative framework governing management and access to government information. That's in particular the Freedom of Information Act, the Archives Act, and to a lesser extent the Privacy Act. Now that legislative framework has largely remained untouched since the 1980s. And that's when government largely operated in a paper-based environment. Certainly didn't have computers back then. Well, we had computers back then, but we certainly weren't using them very frequently. So what we want to do is to move to a simpler and more coherent framework that better reflects the digital era. And this is a project that we led out of the Attorney General's Department. And it does have quite a lot of, it does have a long time frame associated with it. So the plan itself does have a 2-year time frame in general, and most of the commitments stick to that 2-year time frame. There are some that we do recognise are going to take longer time though. This is obviously a very big project that we're looking at doing here in terms of these reforms. And it's one that necessitates a longer time frame to make sure that there's adequate consultation, and that obviously with quite a detailed and complex legislative framework that we work through all of those issues. The action plan also includes a commitment here around better understanding the use of freedom of information and how the public's using freedom of information laws. So this is about the Commonwealth working with the states and territories to essentially develop some deliver some uniformity around the data that we collect and publish around how the public uses freedom of information laws. That'll help us better understand or better compare how those freedom of information laws are operating across the jurisdictions, and also better compare how how they're operating and the effectiveness of them compared to other countries. We've also got a commitment here around improving the discoverability and accessibility of government data and information. And this is about government being a bit more proactive and making information more centralised and accessible online, so people don't have to go so far in searching for it. Covers a whole range of different areas. It includes work being undertaken in the Department of Finance to centralise grants information across government, making it easier for people to find information on grants that the government's awarded and also upcoming grants processes. It also includes work around making it easier and more, making it a more accessible location for corporate and annual reports from departments. And digitising archived records held by the National Archives of Australia. Data is obviously an element to this commitment as well, and we've got a commitment here to improve data.gov.au, which is the government's infrastructure, online infrastructure for people to access and use government data sets. Alrighty, that's it for that theme as well. I think we've got a couple of questions which has come through, which is great. First is from Amanda. She said, does data include documents, i.e. reports and discussion papers? Amanda, when we're talking about, in this theme in particular, access to government information, when we talk about information, we're certainly not just talking about data, we're talking about information more generally. When we talk about information management and access laws for the 21st century, and we talk about the legislative framework and reforming the legislative framework that governs those information management and access, we're talking about information documents, all information held by government. We're not just talking about data. When we talk about data itself and the data thing that we had before, we are talking more about actual data sets that are held by government. So there is some differentiation there, but certainly what we're trying to do through the action plan is to cover both of those elements. Got a question from Paul here as well. Is there a thought about harmonising FOI laws with the states and territories? That's a really good question, Paul. Certainly, that's not something that we've proposed through this action plan. I think that's something that would, obviously it's a conversation that would need to be had with the states and territories, and this action plan is largely focused on actions at the Commonwealth level. You might be interested to know, though, that there is a bit of work already being undertaken by the information commissioners across the country, where they're looking to essentially create a bit of a compendium of information access laws across all the jurisdictions, and so you'd be able to compare each of the different elements of those legislation across the jurisdiction. So that'll at least provide a bit of a baseline to better understand where there are similarities. And I think there are actually already a lot of similarities across the jurisdictions when it comes to freedom of information laws, but also look at where some of the differences are as well. And I guess that'll provide a bit of a baseline for having a conversation about the sort of question that you asked. Great. No more questions on that one for now. I know we've got one more. Will there be a connection to 3.1 and intellectual property law reform? Certainly, there hadn't been, the 3.1 and intellectual property law reform. That's something that still needs to be worked through. Certainly, if you have a look at the commitment itself, you'll see that, as I mentioned at the start of the session, the commitments are at a relatively high level. What we don't want to do is try to rule a lot of things in or out at this stage. There is quite a lot of work to be done around the detail of some of these commitments. I'm not exactly sure on the interactions between that commitment and the question about what's happening around intellectual property. And I know that the Productivity Commission's obviously done some work on that recently. What we'll do though, as I mentioned, we'll follow up with the Attorney General's Department. We can certainly ask that question and come back to you in that blog post. Great. Alrighty, we might move on again. Okay, our fourth theme here is around integrity in the public sector. This is obviously something that's really important for the functioning of our the functioning of our democracy. What we're looking to do here is try to improve the transparency and integrity in public sector activities to build confidence and trust in government. And it's something, as I mentioned, it's incredibly important. It's obviously very topical. Got three commitments here again. It's the magic number, 3. First one here is around confidence in the electoral system and political parties. And we obviously know that there are concerns in the community about some aspects of the system here, such as political donations. What we recognise as well, though, is that there's a lot of complex issues to work through here when it comes to change. And it also requires the involvement and support of the Parliament. What this commitment, if you've read the action plan, you'll notice that this commitment refers to the government has referred to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, which is a parliamentary committee, an inquiry into a range of matters relating to the 2016 election, relating to the use of technology in elections, and also the framework of donations to political parties and other political entities. So, as noted in the action plan, the government will consider the recommendations of that committee before considering any further action in this area or potential reforms in this area. But obviously, the timeframes for that commitment as well are dependent on the parliamentary committee itself. I understand they were undertaking public consultations recently and accepting public submissions. I think at this point, the committee is expected to report sometime next year. And then after that point, the government will look to respond. Second commitment here around the National Integrity Framework. Just to explain this a little bit more, the government takes a multi-agency approach to combating corruption within the public sector. And there are always opportunities to look at how to improve that and to strengthen that framework. It covers a range of different bodies and systems across government. I'll name just a couple. There's the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity, which looks at issues of integrity and corruption within law enforcement bodies within the Commonwealth. We've also got the Australian Federal Police's Fraud and Anti-Corruption Centre. So, as I mentioned before, this commitment's all about looking at the continued strengthening of this framework to ensure we maintain high standards of conduct within government. One of the main elements of this commitment is about regularly reviewing the jurisdiction and capabilities of our anti-corruption agencies. So, they are the two that I mentioned before: the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity and the AFP's Fraud and Anti-Corruption Centre. And the purpose of reviewing the jurisdiction and capabilities, of course, is to consider whether they need to be extended on an as-needed basis to address issues of corruption within the public sector. It also includes work within the Attorney General's Department to review laws applying to foreign bribery, anti-money laundering, and counter-terrorism financing. So it's various. As I mentioned, this is about looking at this issue of integrity and corruption within government or within the public sector, looking at it anti-corruption. Looking at it within the context of the broad framework and system that we've got in place, and look at, well, how can we look to improve and strengthen that over time? We've got a commitment there around that, and I'll talk through in a sec the mechanisms that we'll be putting in place to oversee the implementation of this action plan. But of course, like with all of these commitments, including the National Integrity Framework, what we'll be doing is working with civil society to oversee the implementation of these, ensure that they meet people's expectations. Third commitment here around open contracting. This is all about governments needing to be transparent around their use of taxpayers' money. We already have quite significant transparency around government contracts and tenders through the AusTender website. What we're proposing here is to publicly review Australia's compliance with the Open Contracting Data Standard. And that's seen as sort of the international benchmark, sets out the key documents and data that should be published at each stage of government procurement processes. I got a question the other day in Canberra around what is the Open Contracting Standard? What is the Open Contracting Partnership? What is it all about, and who runs it? It is actually an independent international initiative. It is governed by its own steering committee. It's something that governments worldwide have been signing up to, but it's not something that has been managed through the United Nations, the OECD, or anything like that. Alrighty, we've got a couple of questions here, or maybe one from Elizabeth. Integrity in government depends greatly on responses to political donations. What specifically is being done in this area? That's a really good question, Elizabeth. I'll just go back to that commitment that we've got at the start there around confidence in the electoral system and political parties. I've actually got a copy of the plan here with me. So the government has asked the Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters to investigate a range of issues, and one of those is donations to political parties and other political entities. And I'll just read out this part of the plan for you, Elizabeth. That includes the extent of donations being received from foreign sources and the options available to Parliament to regulate these types of donations. So that's what that inquiry is looking at, and what the government will do is once the committee's looked through that issue, and it is quite a complex issue, So I know that some people, would like government just to sort of come out and sort of say, this is what we're going to do on political donations. But there are actually a lot of legal and constitutional considerations that need to be looked at before we take action in that area. It's obviously an issue as well that needs to go through the Parliament, and that's why the government's referred the matter to a joint parliamentary inquiry to make sure that it's looked at by all sides of the Parliament. Got a question here from Nigel. Can we be assured that the issue of federal ICAC is not ruled out of scope? It's a good question as well, Nigel. You notice that the federal ICAC isn't mentioned, or the idea of a federal ICAC isn't mentioned in this action plan. What we talk about here, and this is the government's policy position, is strengthening the existing national integrity framework. We did seek, obviously this is an issue, again, it's quite topical, and we know that there's a lot of stakeholders that have an interest in it. I just want to reiterate again that this is the start of the process. This is our first action plan. This is an iterative process. It's something that we can build on over time. Certainly, I can't speak on whether a federal ICAC is ruled in or out. I can't speak on the government's behalf in regards to that. We haven't included it in this action plan, but I know that it's something that has been raised with us by many stakeholders, and it's something that I'm sure will be continued to discuss over time. One of the things that I think is really important, though, is that we've got this conversation going around integrity in the public sector and anti-corruption in the public sector and how we can improve it. We've got it as a goal in the plan to try to deal with it. And that at least provides a basis for a conversation about how we actually go about doing that and what are the mechanisms that are available to us. Of course, federal ICAC is one of those, but there are a range of others as well. Alrighty, no further questions at this point, Caroline? No worries, we'll move on to our last theme then, which is public participation and engagement. There's two elements to this commitment. The first one's around public participation and engagement in the Open Government Partnership going forward, and how the government continues engaging with civil society and tries to improve the engagement that we've already had. Obviously, we've got a lot of feedback around that. How we improve the engagement that we have with civil society on both the delivery of this National Action Plan and also the development of our next National Action Plan, which will be due in 2018. Sorry, I'm just going to have a mouthful of water. Alrighty, so the primary commitment within this particular element of the plan is around establishing a multi-stakeholder forum. This is a requirement of the Open Government Partnership, but it's also something that we're very keen to continue. As I mentioned, we do have an interim working group in place at the moment, but it is just that, it is an interim group. What we want to do is establish something a bit more permanent, and certainly we haven't prescribed within the plan what that will look like, because there are a range of different ideas out there, I think, around what that multi-stakeholder forum could look like and how people want to engage in this process. So what we're going to do is engage in a consultation around that after this plan's finalised, seek ideas from you around what you want to see in a multi-stakeholder forum, and then look at, from there, look at finalising what that will look like early in the new year. We've also got a commitment here around enhancing public participation in government decision making more broadly. So this is separate to our work on the Open Government Partnership. This is about government policy making, service delivery and decision making. How do we try to improve at the Commonwealth level how we consult and engage with the public? We know that there's a lot of interesting work happening internationally, but there's also a lot of interesting work happening here in the jurisdictions, in the states and territories, but also local government, who we spoke to last week, and said that there's a whole range of interesting things that they're doing, and that we can learn from them quite a lot as well. What we're planning to do as part of this commitment is develop a new whole of government framework at the Commonwealth level to guide how the Commonwealth engages with the public and how we consult. This is about sort of developing some guiding principles, some guidance for departments around how consultation should be done and what good consultation looks like. It's also about being a bit more innovative in how we go about consultation. Obviously, the digital revolution opens up a whole range of new opportunities for us in terms of how we consult with people. And there's some really interesting things happening, as I mentioned, in the states and territories internationally in regards to that. So we want to look at that international experience. We want to look at that domestic experience. We want to look at what we're doing in the Commonwealth already. We want to try to develop a bit of a base, a bit of a benchmark around what good consultation is, and then try to promote that across government. Alrighty, now we'll take a couple of questions here now. We've got one from Daniel here. It would be appropriate to have high-level terms of reference attached to the plan to guide the early work of the lead government agency and civil society groups that may wish to be involved in designing the forum. Thanks very much, Daniel. That's really great feedback. If that's something that people are interested in, I personally don't see any reason why we couldn't look at providing a bit more information to sort of guide what that work will look like. So great feedback. Thanks very much. Now from Amanda, how does the Public Participation Challenge relate to the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science Engagement Challenge, which is on right now? That's a really good question, Amanda, and it's something, what you'll notice in the plan is that the Department of Industry is actually the lead agency on that particular commitment. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet is actually the lead agency on delivery of the action plan generally, so we'll be working very closely with all of the agencies responsible for each of these commitments. But in relation to this specific commitment, we're very aware that the Industry Department has that challenge on at the moment. So for those of you who aren't aware, the government announced last year as part of its National Innovation and Science Agenda an initiative called the Business Research and Innovation Initiative. I think I've got that right. Don't have it here in front of me. And what the Department of Industry is doing there is putting out a range of different public policy challenges, inviting innovative submissions from people about how do we actually go about addressing them. One of those challenges is around digital engagement in government and developing a new digital platform around how can we better engage the public. So that's certainly something that we've got in mind to incorporate as part of this work, and I know it's something that's very much at the front of the Department of Industry's mind as they take this commitment forward. Great. Any more questions there, Caroline? No, no problems. Well, we might move on to now. I just want to briefly talk about another part of the plan here, which is about Australia's leadership internationally. So we obviously already play a very important role in promoting more effective governance, both in our own region here in the Indo-Pacific, but also globally. What we recognise is that our participation in the Open Government Partnership really provides us with an opportunity to elevate that leadership role and demonstrate good practice to other countries in our region and around the world. What we also recognise within the plan is that the National Action Plan, the Open Government Partnership generally, can provide a mechanism to help support the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and its 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And that's in particular Goal 16 on peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice and effective institutions, but there's a whole range of other sustainable development goals there as well, where you can see the elements of the Open Government Partnership around transparency, accountability, public participation and technological innovation can play a key role in delivering on some of those goals. So what we've committed to in the plan is to endorsing the Open Government Partnership's Joint Declaration on Open Government for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. And what that commits us to is to transparency, openness, accountability and public participation in the domestic and international implementation of the 2030 Agenda. It also commits us to looking at how we can use our action plans in the future to delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. Alrighty, do we have any questions on that one there, Caroline? No?
We'll answer them at the end.
No problems at all. We'll take those at the end. I'll just briefly speak about governance and then we'll come back to any other questions that we've missed during the session. So the Minister for Finance, Senator the Honourable Matthias Cormann, is the lead minister within the Commonwealth for the Open Government Partnership. He released the action plan last Monday, and he'll be responsible for coordinating implementation of the action plan and also leading the Australian government's ongoing involvement in the Open Government Partnership. The Minister will be supported by our department, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and we'll be playing, we've obviously played a role since November last year in developing the action plan, and we'll continue playing that role going forward in terms of driving its implementation across government. It's obviously critically important. It's all very well and good to announce something, but we are very well aware that the focus on implementation is just as important and just as difficult. We'll also be supporting the Minister in terms of some of the other requirements of us from the Open Government Partnership around producing a self-assessment report around how we developed the plan, the quality of the public consultation that we undertook during the process, and also how we're going about implementing the plan. And also responding to what's known as the independent reporting mechanism, which is the governance mechanism that the OGP has in place to independently look at how governments have developed their plans, look at how they're being implemented and provide recommendations for improvement. And now I do have the name actually of our independent reporting mechanism lead here in Australia, and that's Daniel Stewart, who's an academic here at the ANU in Canberra. Alrighty, excellent. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the actual presentation. We do have a couple of more questions. So got one here from Christopher. What sort of reporting mechanisms are expected to be in place for departments and jurisdictions to report against their open government efforts? That's a great question, Christopher. And certainly we are looking at having a reporting system in place. We're still settling exactly what that will look like, but certainly there is some guidance from the Open Government Partnership about that. We will be looking at having something online that will be transparent in terms of how things are tracking. We want to also make sure that that multi-stakeholder forum plays a role in overseeing implementation, that there's reports going to them about how things are being implemented, and they're able to provide feedback to government as well, so that there is a conversation about implementation, that we're not just having these conversations about the development of the action plan and that we stop there, that we continue this conversation after the point at which we submit it. Got a question here from Daniel as well. There was already a framework in place, but as experienced public participation professionals working at the coalface will often testify that a greater barrier is capacity. Rather than a guidance product, there are lots of these already, is there any work on systems and human capacity? I think that's a really great question as well, Daniel. It's certainly something in the development of this action plan, we've been talking to the South Australian government, who have been undertaking a lot of work in this space around public participation and engagement, and I know that certainly capacity is something at front of mind for them. I think it's certainly something that will have to be front of mind in terms of taking this forward. If we're going to be driving better consultation across government, that obviously necessitates a level of improving capacity as well. So really good point. If that's something that's not coming out clearly in the plan, I think that's something we can go back and have a look at. Now, we've got a question here. Chris, OGP team was sent some questions earlier in the day, Chris, and we just have printed that out, and I've got a copy here with me. So we do have one question. I'll try to get to the crux of it, Chris. More than welcome to publish the whole thing on the chat as well, though. So, got a question here. Sorry, I'm just getting to the end of it. So the question's here about why, if the second attempt at public awareness and consultation, why haven't we improved over the first process that we undertook earlier in the year? There has been less publicity, extremely limited, readily comprehensible information provided about the OGP, and short time to organise the public briefings and take part in a webinar, etc. No notice via our email system of the live streaming of the Brisbane event and of this webinar. And a ridiculously short time to comment about such complex issues as are covered in the NAP. And I think, so I'll just respond to that in a couple of ways, Chris. First, I just want to just reiterate that we do have some timeframes here that we're working to that are set by the Open Government Partnership. This is obviously our first National Action Plan. We understand that it's actually Open Government Partnership. It's not something that's commonly known by the person in the street. It's something that we need to continue to lift our efforts in terms of building awareness. I think this public consultation process has already brought in new people, which is great. New people becoming aware of it, but it's something that absolutely we need to be focused on over time. It's something that I think the multi-stakeholder forum will play an incredibly important role in terms of continuing to try to lift the quality of how we promote and how do we build awareness of the Open Government Partnership and these national action plans among the general public. Question about the timeframes to comment on the plan. As I mentioned, there are timeframes, deadlines set by the Open Government Partnership. We have extended the deadline today for public comments until next Friday, the 18th of November. So we have given some more time. We've got 3 working weeks there. Obviously, I understand that some people would like some more time. What we're trying to do is balance the need to go out and ensure that people have an opportunity to have their say, and we've got the chance to take that on board with the need to meet those deadlines by the Open Government Partnership. And I think, Chris, you did also have a question here about what are the consequences of Australia for Australia if we don't meet that timetable that's set by the Open Government Partnership. You've noted that the National Action Plan will be moved into the 2017 Action Plan cycle, which means our next one won't be due until 2019, and that's absolutely correct. There are other consequences as well. The Open Government Partnership can consider countries who don't meet their obligations under the partnership. They can consider listing them as inactive. That's something that was done to Turkey earlier this year when they didn't submit their action plan after several action plan cycles and after a request from the Open Government Partnership. And that's certainly something that we don't want to see here in Australia. As I said, though, what's really important is this is our first action plan. It's really important that we bed this down, that we have a foundation to work from over time. This isn't the end of the process by any means. It's something that we want to continue a conversation on, and it's a process of continual improvement. Do we have a couple of other questions? I know, Chris, you've got a couple of other questions here as well, which I'll come back to. Just got a couple of other questions here from a few other of our participants today. One from Daniel. Why is it important to have EITI in the NAP? I might actually just stop this share as well so you can see me properly there. Great. Why is it important to have EITI in the NAP, given it is a very public commitment and cannot fall through the gap? Isn't it distracting/padding? That's a good question. And Daniel, it's one of the conversations that we have with the Open Government Partnership Support Unit as well. To what extent do we include things that the government's already committed to, albeit at a very high level in the National Action Plan, compared to including completely new commitments? Something that the support unit really encouraged us to include. They definitely want to see us including some of these high-level commitments that have been made by government in the past, but don't already have a lot of information around them in terms of how they're going to be implemented. So certainly while it's a very public commitment, one of the things that we're very conscious of within government, within the public service, is the need to ensure that we've got vehicles to take these things forward and ensure they're implemented. That there are very clear timeframes for implementation, that we've got some milestones that we're working through, and that they don't fall through the gaps. Unfortunately, a lot of things do fall through the gaps, and we certainly don't want to see that happen with any of the key initiatives in this space. Certainly something I think that the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative Secretariat itself is very keen to see within the plan, and something that Publish What You Pay, which is a group here within Australia, has also been pushing for quite a lot as well. Question here as well from both from Daniel and Peter. This is clearly led by the Commonwealth, but to what extent have the states and territories been involved? Is there to be any formal COAG type engagement? And Peter just added, and ultimately to local government. So this is very much a national action plan, or a Commonwealth action plan, I should say. The Open Government Partnership itself has very much been focused on national governments. I think globally, what you see in the majority of action plans is commitments from national governments. We have had some discussions with the states and territories and also local government around the plan. It's something that we want to continue building on, something that we understand we need to continue building on. But certainly the focus of this first plan has been around the Commonwealth, but we want to engage in a conversation with the states around what do they want to see and how do they want to be engaged in this. There is actually a pilot program being run by the Open Government Partnership, which is looking at subnational open government. So what they're trying to do there is engage local governments, engage state governments in countries around the world, and get them to engage in the development of their own action plans. So that is still at a pilot phase at the moment, but the Open Government Partnership itself is certainly recognised as a need to sort of expand beyond just national government. And it's certainly something that we're very conscious of as well. So we're just really starting that conversation with the states and territories and local government around how they want to be engaged going forward, whether these pilot projects that the Open Government Partnership are running is something that they want to be involved in, or whether they'd rather sort of go through the channel of that national action plan. Great. I don't think there's any other questions on our list here. I've got a couple more here in front of me. One here just about the public information sessions that we've been holding around the country. Why was Adelaide not included, and why was Perth included? So we've done a few public information sessions around the country. We've only done 5, so we've done those in the 5 biggest capital cities. That's the basis on which we selected those public information sessions, just to try to get cover as many people as we could within the time and resources that we had available. Obviously, we didn't reach Adelaide, but we are hosting this webinar as well to ensure that people who weren't able to participate in those public information sessions in Adelaide and Hobart or wherever else they are around the country had an opportunity to engage and ask questions here online. We're also going to be publishing all of this material online. We'll be our Brisbane session was filmed, and we are going to be posting that. I think it's already publicly available online, but we'll make sure that the link is available on our blog. We're also recording today's webinar, and we'll be making that publicly available as well. Certainly, people are also more than welcome to send us an email. We're very open to questions. If anyone's got any questions, which is what these information sessions are all about, giving people an opportunity to ask questions and probe, what we're doing here. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to email us at ogp@pmc.gov.au. Also got some questions here about how many people attended each of the briefings and how many people are participating in this webinar. We'll look to make that information publicly available on the blog. Sorry, I don't have those numbers here with me today. I think maybe on the session today, I think we had around 25, 30? 20 was there? 20 actually participating. So it must have been a few people drop out at the last minute. Great. All right. Well, no worries. Well, thank you everyone for participating. I will just hang around just for a couple more minutes. So if anyone's got any more questions, feel free to send them through. If anyone's got any follow-up questions that they want to ask as well, that they don't want to ask here on the webinar, like I said, I've just provided the email address. I'll provide that again, ogp@pmc.gov.au. Feel free to send those through, and I'm more than happy to answer them there. Caroline, do we have anything else coming through? No? No problems at all. Thank you very much for everyone for participating. Very much appreciated. And look forward to hearing your views through the public submission process. Thanks very much. Bye.